name is Emily Farnworth. I'm the director for the Centre for Climate Engagement at Hughes Hall, University of Cambridge. And we're hosting the Climate Governance Initiative, which is our international platform working with groups of non-executive directors around the world in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. We thank you for joining us today to hear a little bit of these initial reactions from the outcomes of COP28 in Dubai, UAE, this last couple of weeks. I'm going to start with a very sort of quick overview of where we have seen things land. But most importantly, we want to hear from our experts and some of our directors who have been either in Dubai or watching very closely the outcomes of Dubai to get their initial reactions of both their reflections of the conversation that we had and also some of the early conversations they're having with colleagues on their boards, colleagues with other organisations that are relevant to those boardrooms. For those of you, I'm sure, have also been following COP proceedings very well, as is quite traditional for these international conferences. The debates and the negotiations did go late. However, there was a final statement, the UAE consensus, that really was able to agree wording, which didn't necessarily satisfy everybody around phasing out fossil fuels, but transitioning away from fossil fuels in line with science, in line with thinking through a just transition, was something that, as often happens with these statements, some people are celebrating, some people are saying it's nowhere near enough. However, I think the fact that we did have this oil and gas nation hosting a climate COP and being able to bring together some agreement within this very challenged sector was a helpful step forward. There was also a huge amount of progress made on a number of the major global coalitions in areas that we most need it, commitments to renewable energy, big commitments on loss and damage, even though, again, many don't feel that goes far enough. Big commitments, actually, we're seeing in also areas like food systems transition. And so I think there's a lot of positive aspects to take away from this in terms of the willingness of governments to come together to really look at how they can collaborate on some of these more challenging areas that need work, as well as needing to think about this continual focus on transitioning away from fossil fuels so that we can reduce emissions as quickly as possible. It's wonderful to have such an incredible panel with us here today, and I have the great pleasure of introducing a wonderful lineup of speakers. We have Karina Litvak, who sits on a number of different boards, is a veteran in understanding climate action and how you push this into the boardroom. We have Pim Velger, head of climate ambition initiatives at the World Economic Forum, who's obviously a close partner of ours in the Climate Governance Initiative. Changhua Wu, who again holds many different hats, both in the context of being an expert in this field and a fellow of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs in China, as well as sitting on a number of boards herself. And Cristina Pinho, who's board member of the Brazilian Institute of Corporate Governance, as well as, again, being herself a non-executive director. And so I just want to say a warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for joining this panel today. We're going to have some time to hear from our panelists on their initial high-level reflections of what they've seen coming out of the discussions in Dubai. We're going to have a few questions that will tease out a little bit more, kind of what does this mean for the boardroom? How are people really kind of talking about this, and what are people initially responding to? And then we're going to open up the floor for some questions. So please do, as we're going through this discussion, please do add your questions into the Q&A section, and we'll come to those at the end. I'm hopefully going to see a number of you kind of asking questions that are particularly pertinent to the boardroom. I mean, this webinar is very explicitly guided towards what's coming out of these global negotiations and how do boardrooms in particular respond, which is a very important role in the context of driving good corporate governance. So I'm going to open up and ask initially if my colleague Pim could perhaps give her initial reflections from her perspective. I know the World Economic Forum was very engaged in these negotiations and conversations going into the event. So it would be great to hear from you initially.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily, and greetings everyone from the World Economic Forum in Geneva. So as Emily said, I think for me, this COP was really about the sort of 3 F, the future of fossils, finance and food systems transformation. And as Emily said, of course, the final outcome left a lot unsaid. The negotiations were heavily dominated for many, many days around the phasing out or phasing down. But I think the fact that we got the transition away from fossil fuels is consequential. And as the Spanish environment minister said, who led the EU's negotiation, it took us 30 years to get this word into the final document. I think that, in combination with the target on tripling renewable energy and doubling the energy efficiency rates from 2% to 4%, has sort of meant that this COP has really sent an unequivocal sort of signal to countries, companies, and financial markets around the world that we have to get on with decarbonizing our energy systems. But I think another sort of nuance that also came through quite strong on the ground in COP is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities that also was referenced actually 4 times in the outcome document. And what this really it means is that there is an explicit expectation that developing countries now must take the lead, and that there must be support for poorer countries that face greater energy insecurity and challenges. But I think that first getting fossils into the actual outcome declaration is consequential and a positive move ahead. Now, on finance, I also felt that gaveling the loss and damage fund on the first day sent a positive signal, and it sort of contributed to a sense that it is possible to move forward on some of the more thorny and difficult issues. Of course, the agreement on the operationalization of the loss and damage fund and its funding arrangements are still provisionary. It will be seated with the World Bank, and we will see how it will be evolving. And the finance commitment of 700 million that we saw is a drop in the sea when you look at the actual the trillions that will be needed to support companies with their clean energy transitions. I also felt that there were quite a lot of innovations discussed around finance and new sort of players emerging on the horizon, including, for instance, philanthropy. The World Economic Forum was there together with our initiative that looks at public, private, and philanthropic funding to see how we can de-risk a lot of the investments that are needed. And overall, I would say the concept of de-risking was really pertinent and was a key issue that came through very strongly in the finance negotiations. How do we de-risk capital? What is the role of, for instance, insurance, the insurance market in helping us to de-risk and creating confidence in these investments? So quite a few new interesting aspects there. And the third area where I saw some progress was also on food. This was a major moment for food systems transformation. As we know, food systems are responsible for 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions and 80% of deforestation and 70% of fresh water use. The fact that there was a declaration that was signed by over 150 countries covering 70% of global food production was quite significant. There were a lot of dairy, meat, agricultural representatives on the ground. The World Economic Forum, we actually launched our First Movers Coalition for Food, which is aimed at aggregating market demand for sustainably produced and low emissions agricultural commodities. So this was also an area where I think we saw progress. And then I just wanted to say that I think overall, the nexus issues also took quite a lot of space at this COP. So not only, food, but also water, health. It was the first global day and COP declaration on the linkages between climate impact and global health. And there was also quite strong linkage to the nature agenda. So there was the inclusion of a 2030 deforestation goal. And also there was reference, of course, to the Kunming-Montreal framework. So we see a bit of shortening of the distance between the two traditional COPs, the COP on climate and the COP on nature. And I thought that was quite conducive. So those were a few impressions from the ground. That there was a lot of activity in Dubai last week. So back to you, Emily.
Thank you so much, Pim. It's just so helpful. And I love the way that you framed that around fossil fuels, finance, and food. I think that probably sums up a lot of what we're hearing from some of the narrative and some of the pieces that are coming out. So thank you so much. Really, really helpful overview. I'm now going to ask Changhua to come in, and Changhua, as I'm sure you'll give a particular flavour, I guess, from China's perspective, but I think your overall view of this, I think, would be really, really valuable. So over to you for your reflections.
Sure. Thank you, Emily. And thank you for the opportunity to join this distinguished panel as well. I definitely strongly concur with the Pim's observations already. And beyond that, I'm going to add a little bit more perspective from my own experience at the COP28, as well as the China perspective there. So in the Chinese sort of old saying, in order to deliver success, it takes a favorable, alignment of objective subject factors there. I think that's pretty much all the factors coming together. We managed to have a more inspiring sort of outcome out of the Dubai climate conference, the COP28 there. A lot of people have been asking around to say, what factors played, more prominent role in terms of really, moving forward in terms of where we are today. I think a lot of factors are said already. I'm going to add a little bit more, a few more. Firstly, I think I want to emphasize the importance of US and China coming together before COP28. Something called the Sunnyland Joint Statement, Climate Statement between US and China during the APEC summit. If you read it into it, actually, you pretty much can tell the flavor, which to a certain extent set the tone for the COP28 on a couple of fronts. One, the two largest economies and emitters agreed that they're going to work together to support a successful COP28 process. Psychologically, mentally, that's a very important piece of the puzzle. And secondly, if you look at the fossil fuel, energy transition piece, tripling renewable energy there, energy efficiency sort of there, methane, really addressing a non-carbon other greenhouse gases element there, particularly focusing on methane there as well. To a certain extent, that sort of set the foundation, set the tone for the global negotiation on transitioning actually away from fossil fuels there as well. Second element, I do want to sort of re-emphasize in a way, thanks to the UAE presidency's leadership, it has demonstrated the capability, skills to pull everything together in the context of all the complexity, controversial issues there. So really kudos actually to the presidency. And the third element is really China. And if you look at, globally, I think there were two exponential curves, pretty much sort of hanging over the whole COP28. One side is the negative tipping points, and with all the scientific data coming out, planetary boundaries there, the tipping points reports coming out, definitely adding this sense of crisis, a sense of urgency there. But then there's also the other side, which is a positive tipping points, mostly, attributed to China's dramatic efforts in terms of clean energy revolution there. If you look at the solar, wind, EV batteries there, right, without China's contribution, leadership in the industrial value chain, manufacturing capability there, there's no way we would have come to that point to have this sort of a positive tipping points created to counterbalance the negative tipping points there as well. Now, looking into this transition piece of the puzzle, and it's not like we haven't really done anything, and now we're going to really do the transition. Rather, if you look at China, particularly US, EU, large economies there, we've been sort of transforming and transitioning already towards a clean energy future. But somehow, in reality, we all been bumped into all kinds of hurdles, barriers there. So the pace and the scale have been sort of held back by many, factors, including geopolitical part, supply chain security, this US and China thing, whatever, stuff like that. COP28, even though a lot of people complaining about too many people showed up, whatever, but there is a very strong positive element, functions out of the process. Can you imagine the largest ever group of people coming together to deep dive to share, to discuss, and trying to figure out how to work with each other, in particular, actually focusing on accelerating the transition away from fossil fuels and towards a clean energy future. Even though no one could manage, showing up in all the sort of sessions, whatever side events there, but just within whatever your circle there, I know I participated quite a number of them during the first week when I was there. I particularly appreciate this deep diving elements. And so while, sharing successes, achievements, whatever, they are all the practitioners, leadership, business, different sectors that they are sharing their learning reality in terms of hurdles, barriers they bumped into. And very importantly, through those sort of large and small side events, they were discussing with each other and trying to figure out how to address them. And I think that's very important, actually, side benefits coming out of this, the largest ever COP there. And beyond that, and I know there are a couple of other controversial issues around the role of China, including the financing part. China decided to carry on its Green Belt and Road Initiative, as well as South Climate Partnership there, to working with other countries there. So I'm not a government official, so we'll see how things are moving forward. And very importantly, I think this integrity, accountability, data transparency becomes another very prominent sort of role in terms of progressing, the assurance of accountability of, financial sector, business sector, you name it there. And a couple of initiatives announced, and one in particular, the Bloomberg philanthropy around this net zero data public utility, which is potentially actually, which could be very disruptive actually for the future. I participated in one particular session with the ISSB, some other players actually in this accountability transparency sector. I know ISSB has really gained a lot of support in that process. Just to report on that, so far there are 20 Chinese companies and institutions qualified as something called P4 East. It's a partnership for early awareness of sustainability, transparency, whatever, stuff like that. So this is a major step taken, by ISSB and other partners. So we need to really move forward. You need pioneers actually to do it and make it happen, and their learning could be shared with many others as well. Other than that, and overall, I remain very positive. I do understand how challenging it is going to be, particularly from China perspective, because China is not necessarily at the beginning of the revolution. This is another new phase of clean energy transition, transformational revolution. There are going to be a lot of hurdles, barriers that need to be re-examined, and particularly figuring out how to work with the global community, particular large economies in that context there, in order to really contribute more constructively to the accelerated transition away from fossil fuels. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Changhua. So helpful, and just really so helpful to hear that particular perspective. We're going to move over to Brazil now, a slightly different perspective, and I guess also thinking through, moving to 2025 and the COP we're going to be hosting there. But Christina, we won't kind of get ahead of ourselves too much. It would be wonderful to hear your reflections of what you're sort of seeing coming out of COP28. Any additional thoughts that you want to bring to this initial opening conversation?
Thank you so much. First of all, I'm very pleased to be here with you. And last time we saw each other, it was in Cambridge in our technical journey with a corporate governance, Brazilian Corporate Governance Institute. But it's a very pleasure for me to be here with you. And Brazil was negotiating a final agreement in Dubai that would sign a gradual reduction in the use of fossil fuel, as well United Kingdom, USA, and European Union. At the end, the approved text calls countries to contribute to a gradual energy transition to achieve net zero emissions in 2050. This was a great thing, I think, after all this discussion. Brazil has a very privileged position in relation to its energy matrix. When compared to the world average, 48% of our matrix is made up of renewable energy, and its electrical matrix is even more relevant, with more than 82% made up of clean energy. Then the problem of Brazilian emissions is related to land use, agriculture, and illegal deforestation. Therefore, for the country's image, it's very important to have actions to reduce emissions in these three factors, especially in deforestation in its biome, tropical forest, Cerrado, and Atlantic forest. Then what Brazilian government has been doing, he has been working closely with the ministries of environment, finance, planning, industry and commerce, mines and energy, and those related to social impacts, so that the plans of each of them are strongly focused on sustainability and anticipation to climate emergency and reduction of greenhouse gas. Though the energy transition plan that we have been building, the country seeks a more comprehensive transition as a new economic development paradigm that focuses on the long term and its benefits of the environmental, social, and governance agenda. The agreement signed between the nations is much better than those presented in previous COPs. I think so. This is my perception. The reduction of methane, the increase of investments in renewable energy and energy efficiency indicates that the investors, the path to pursue to incorporate these in the investments of the companies, and the councils must take these points of the agreement into discussion, as companies' strategic planning must take into account that it was thanks to the pressure from society that these inclusions were agreed upon. Especially councils as for example, my segment, whose companies are connected to energy segment, should spend more time discussing the future of the business. We are clearly moving towards an agenda of transferring fossil fuel energy matrix to renewable energy in the world. And this could be a threat to the business that are not observing new opportunities for action. We made a survey recently in the Governance Brazilian Institute that was very interesting. We made an interview with 104 members of boards, and related to some aspects as leadership, ownership, strategy, and measurement, about how the boards are facing the climate impact, the net zero strategy. And the results, they are not very good. 55% understand that they understand the implication of climate change, okay. But almost 48% do not take into consideration board discussions. 70% do not incorporate goals into executive incentives, and 36% do not consider this issue in their risk matrix. 50% do not indicate targets for reaching net zero by 2050. Then, we know that the councils are responsible for the sustainability of the companies, guaranteeing their continuity in the generation of wealth, employment, and income. So, the inclusion of a climate change in the council's agenda in their risk matrix, including investments that increase business resilience, is not yet present in many councils. So, after this COP, more than ever, it's necessary for companies, councils, and leadership to embrace the strategy agenda of zero net emissions in 2050, paying attention to their scopes 1, 2, and 3 in their operations. They take ownership of these terms, inserted them into the company's strategy with objectives, plan, and process that demonstrate their ambitions. Then this is the picture that we have today in the councils in Brazil. It's a concern, but we improved something in some of these items between 2022 and 2023, but we have a huge gap to fulfill.
Thank you so much, Christina. And it's really, it's really interesting just to hear some of those stats. And I guess you've already started to indicate, I mean, maybe just a quick follow-up question for you in the context of, some of the outcomes of the COP. And do you get a sense that there is an increased awareness raising within the business community through these big international events? And I mean, would you hope, and I don't know if you can give an indication of how quickly you would hope that some of those statistics in the boardroom would change over the coming years?
Yes, I think so. I think after this COP, all this discussion and the way that we have this agreement, this will shake the people here, especially for the segment of energy that I'm part of. I
Yeah.
know that some of my colleagues that are member of the council, they have already all the discussion about the final agreement, and I know that they are realize that my perception is that all these people, all the CEOs, the executives, and some of them, they finally they will realize that we are in the beginning of the end of this era, fossil. I
Yeah.
think so, and I think all of them that are not, they now this will be more present in their discussions in the council. I hope. I will work for this, but then I know that this will work because you cannot ignore the pressure of the society anymore.
Thank you so much. Just finally, Karina, I'll come to you. I mean, it's a hard thing to kind of come last when you've heard all of these wonderful things and comments already. But is there anything additional you would add, or maybe given your kind of deep experience in understanding the energy sector in all of its senses, whether or not in particular it would be wonderful to hear some of your reflections of what you've been hearing from the COP.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I share your view that this is the glass more than half full, even though, I mean, all of the criticisms that we've heard are absolutely justified. But I think what people often don't realize, and I see this, unfortunately, because I've been inside the boardroom, but it's the same if you're in trade association meetings, OPEC meetings, whatever it may be, when you get a group of people together who are in any part of the fossil fuel business, they're in their bubble and they absolutely, do not accept that the world will change. So the fact that this happened is immense. The fact that UAE pushed it through is immense. I mean, our expectations were extremely low, to be fair. So this has exceeded them, but this is extraordinary. And, Saudi Arabia has a history of torpedoing everything over the years. And this time, evidently, UAE did not want a failure on its hands, and they made it happen. So it's not that I want to, heap praise on someone who did a little bit instead of everything, but I do think it's important to take on board just how difficult it is to work with people who have a long history of doing something, who have a lot of money, a lot of political clout, a lot of geopolitical support. And so, and yes, there are loopholes, and it's incumbent on all of us not to be distracted because of those loopholes. But I do think this is a big step forward. And I'm a little nervous about next year because Azerbaijan, doesn't have a reputation to lose in the way that UAE does. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But my hopes are really pinned on Brazil, even though Brazil did some not so good things. I don't mean to criticize you, Christina, but let's be, some of those things Brazil said and did are. So back to what I'm seeing in boardrooms. When you do business there, you have to be friends with the government. So all of the discussions with ADNOC, the UAE, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, have been around the quote unquote transition, but they've been exclusively about green hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. So this language about transitioning away is massive, and it'll be very interesting to see how people pin their corporate strategies onto that. Now, I want to turn for a sec. I'm now on the board of a much, much smaller oil and gas company whose practices really lag, the practices of the majors. That's just an objective fact. But the agreement that was reached with 51, I think it was, national oil companies and American oil companies, and the Europeans who were already far ahead joined in just to be nice on methane reduction is really meaningful because it sets a bar for the smaller companies who are not doing enough. So that was something I was able to bring up already 2 weeks ago and say, folks, we have to do this, whether we like it or not. If Saudi Arabia is doing, or actually, I don't know if Saudi Aramco is in there. Who are we to say that we can't? I mean, we have to do it. the other really interesting thing, so you do have, I think, the opportunity as a director to point to things that have come out of this agreement and, put it on the table in the boardroom and say, what are we going to do about this? We need to get our act together. The other thing that was really interesting for me is I'm also on the board of Terna, which is the power grid operator in Italy. So it's like the national grid in the UK or RTE or all these other grid operators around the world. It has a monopoly. It loves to think of itself, and rightly so to an extent, as the architect of the transition, because all that electrification depends on connections to the grid. But of course, as everybody knows, grid capacity is wholly inadequate to sustain all of the grid connections that will be necessary to meet 2050 net zero by 2050 targets. And now that we have a collective goal to triple renewable energy in only 6 years, right? In my company, we've planned to increase CapEx and indebtedness by 82%, not by 700%. Okay. So to me, the obvious question, which I posed yesterday in the boardroom as we were going through the strategic plan, was, okay, plus 82% to 2028. Does that mean we're going to do 620% between 2028 and 2030? Or should we maybe revisit our plan and, most importantly, engage with our regulator, who is the one who decides how much we invest, how much we are reimbursed? We don't do anything without the government covering our expenses, because that's the kind of public utility we are. Even though we are 75% listed, it is effectively a government company that does what the government says. And I had a lot of pushback from fellow directors who said, it's the government's job. It's not our job to go and fix climate change. And I said, well, we've been saying for a number of years now that we are the architect of the climate transition. So we need to be at the table with our government to say, how are your goals, Mrs. Brothers of Italy Prime Minister? How are your goals on your NDC, your nationally determined contributions? How are they going to be affected by this obligation that collectively we have to triple renewables in the next 6 years? I mean, it's possible that Italy will claim that it's already ahead of everyone else and can do less. I doubt it, because the penetration of renewables is poor. But nevertheless, it creates extraordinary opportunities for us in the boardroom to say, what about this? What should we be doing? What, can we please question our sponsor, which is the government, in determining how the national targets will change, how the funding that they will give to us will change, how the authorizations will change, because authorizations take forever. It's quicker to connect a renewable power plant in Pakistan than it is in Italy, which is why my former company, which was multiplying its renewable energy, it was an oil and gas major, was developing in Pakistan, because in Italy it was really hard to get permits. So, there are all these different moving parts that companies are very quick to say, it's not us, it's the government, it's the regulator. But the thing is, we have a voice and we should use it. And when I talked to fellow directors about using our voice, they thought that was extraordinarily naive. Honestly, I don't see any alternative, right? I just said, well, the alternative is we all fry. So is that what you want? Or do we go to Rome? Do we go to Brussels? Do we say, as a company, it's not for me to go and overrule my own company, but do we encourage our company to go to these regulators and say, you need to give us the means to do what nationally you have committed to do, because 82% is not 700%.
Yeah. It's a really good point, and I'm actually going to use that to kind of launch into now our kind of panel discussion. And do feel free to come in as we start to have a more open conversation across all of these sort of such great expert voices on the panel. And also just a reminder to those listening in, please do put your questions in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we've got time to come to some of those. I guess just to follow on that point, Karina, which you make, and which is super interesting, particularly with this huge energy transition that we have. And when you do start breaking down the numbers and we realise, how incredibly challenging it is, particularly from this infrastructure point, and your point around what's the role of directors, what's the role of corporates, what's the role of governments, regulators. And I might actually kind of come to Pim next just with a question. And I know that the annual meeting of the World Economic Forum is looming, and obviously being able to bring together those different voices from the broader kind of community that you're working with those governments, or sort of executives as well as non-executive director folks that you have in your network. Where do you think some of this will go next in terms of really being able to build on the coalitions and the commitments that have been made around transition? What are you kind of anticipating, maybe some of the things that are top of mind, and also sort of, are we seeing any kind of step change in the way that boards are really kind of wanting to drive this conversation?
No, I think Karina was spot on. I mean, if we look at the tripling renewable energy target and the NDCs, they are wildly insufficient. Of course, these NDCs will be reviewed, and countries should come up with new ones in 2025. That could be an opportunity. But if I look at even the most advanced countries, like take Sweden, that has the first commercial low emission steel factory up north. If you look at the energy consumption that it's going to take to actually produce green steel at any type of commercial rate, it is enormous. It is not only going to require investments in renewable energy and in the gridding system, it will also require efforts on energy efficiency. And actually, I felt that the energy efficiency target was also an important point made during this COP. And it's almost one of those things that always comes as a secondary thought. But actually, energy efficiency measures will account for 40% of the reductions we need to see the next 20 years. So it's not something to take lightly. But to come back to this the steel factory in the north of Sweden, somebody gave me the calculations that it would take something like 80 terawatt hours, which is the equivalent of Finland's annual energy consumption, to actually, make this happen. And even the most advanced, economies like Sweden do not have the renewable energy capacity for that, or the gridding. So I think we do need to see a much, a speeded up effort on policies, but we also need to see much more innovation when it comes to public-private partnerships to fast track this transition. Some countries have done that better than others. I think of Denmark, for instance. They've taken public-private climate partnerships very seriously. They've even made it part of their national climate strategy, with 14 climate partnerships across the harder to abate sectors that have worked lock in step to come up with solutions. You have the energy islands and the North Sea sort of offshore energy initiative, which exemplifies that. But I think what we will need to see also from the constituents coming to Davos is really, how do we now make sure that the decisions that have come out, the good signals we've seen on transitioning away from fossils, is actually going to happen in reality? And I think, as I said, looking at the de-risking of capital is going to be key, because many of these emerging markets, the cost of capital is much higher, interest rates are much higher, and we still do not have good ways to de-risk capital to make sure that the capital flows are going to these markets so that we can fill that energy gap. Because if our current energy system is 80% fossils, we need to make sure that we scale at the same rate. So I expect some of these questions to come up in the annual meeting.
No, and I guess I'm just Changhua and Christina, from your perspectives in your different regions. Maybe Changhua first. I mean, what do you see in terms of that change between how things are driven through the boardroom, and what additional engagement with government needs to happen to drive things more quickly?
Sure, thank you. I would like to pick up what Karina said, and more than ever, actually, with the consensus now on paper. And so with what we know, actually, all the rules will be reset, right? So this is not a moment to say for companies, board members actually says, let's wait for government to set whatever the new targets or new regulations or policy incentives, then we take the actions. It's not. It's the moment actually for everyone coming together, because we learned through the first decade of transition, particularly from China perspective, it has to be a system change, and it's happening. Right, China has already set a sort of a good example in terms of through its 14th five-year plan, really putting together this level of ambition called the 1+N, really putting the one, which is the core thread, putting everything together, is the decarbonization agenda. Because we said this 2030, before capping before 2030, carbon neutrality before 2060. We could see that's going to be upgraded. We know for sure. But then you cannot just set the targets. So we're going to manage, figure out how to manage the emissions. Rather, this is going to be used. It is used actually as the thread to pull all the other pieces of the puzzle together. I call it a systemic change. It's a huge sort of unprecedented level of experiment at this moment. You started to see all the dots are connected. At all different levels, at the national level, regional level, sector level, down to the products and the services level there. So it's a huge learning curve we're on now. So for companies, particularly for board directors, more than ever, we need to really step out of the box rather than just narrowly focusing on, my legal liability, responsibility on the governance side of the company. But we need to take steps to influence, advocate actually for policy changes. We all know policymakers, rule makers do not just stay in the room and pat on their head and say, oh, this is going to be the rules. Rather, all the rules effective rules need to be made based on the cutting edge practices led by companies there, right? So I think this is the moment for board directors to take that level of step. In reality, I think many things are happening. There are many leaders actually taking that sort of steps. For instance, the policy advocacy influence has been sort of a common practice for private sector in particular, globally and everywhere. But in the meantime, actually, we started to see companies, particularly leading companies, taking a step to really transform supply chain. That's a major step forward, because we do need the levers actually to pull. So, system change, whatever the level we're talking about, particularly for leading companies, leading means more responsibility and more opportunities there as well. So like Tianqi Lithium, the one company I serve as the non-executive board director, launched back in April this year, the first ever global supply chain transformation agenda advocate initiative for lithium critical materials there. Not just look at focusing on narrowly our own operations, but really look upstream, downstream, cutting across, all the sectors you could. There are many other examples from sector-wide. There are many initiatives there as well. That's where I see hope. I'm really optimistic in a way. We do have solutions. It's not a technology issue. Even to a certain extent, the system models, pioneers have already done that, like the example Pim mentioned as well, the green steel agenda there. We really need to come up with this sort of, getting the policy incentives, finance, technology, innovation, market, everything, all the pieces together. That's the major task we need to focus on now.
Yeah, thank you, Changhua. And I might come to you, Christina, for your views. And I might also kind of weave in one of the questions that has come up with regards to nature-based solutions. I mean, given obviously the kind of critical piece of the jigsaw that has in your part of the world, obviously feel free to kind of respond to the conversation we were having before, but in this context of kind of governments and businesses, particularly kind of the board and leadership of companies, working with governments on some of these really, really challenging areas. What's your sense of how that will evolve? And particularly kind of now we're already kind of looking to 2025 and looking at kind of countries ramping up their commitments under the Paris Agreement.
My perception here in Brazil, it's very good also. I have a lot of hope because, as I said in the first part of our discussion, we have this integration that is very, very good between all segments of Brazilian government. And besides, I am part of the council that supports this agenda to the president of Brazil, Mr. Lula. And then what I see is that there is this huge energy to put on this all this ministries, and also to give some financial support to the companies. As it will not be like a huge IRA or something like this, or Green Deal in Europe, because you don't have so much money, but there is energy to put in process, money and financial support for the companies in order to go to this agenda to net zero into 2050. This is what I see, and that's why I think we will move forward to this. And there is another thing that's very important. All of them, these authorities, they know that we have this potential in order to attract investment for NBS, for nature-based solution, because Brazil it's very rich in its biodiversity, and we have all of things, all the resource here in order to attract these investments and then put these projects on a way. And this will be something that will be very discussed during the COP30 that will be in Belém do Pará, in the middle of the Amazon. And then, Emily, answer your question, I would say that this is the most important thing that we have been focused in near future in order to attract these investments and new projects, and to provide this conservation of the biodiversity in Brazil. And I think this will be the thing that Brazil will really could be protagonist on this agenda of net zero 2050 for the world.
Yeah. Thank you. It's really helpful. We talked in the initial kind of conversation about the piece around the finance that's been pledged. I mean, it's always one thing to say how much money you're going to give, and quite another to deliver on it. And from a company perspective, in the context of the boardroom, we had a question in the context of actually putting a price on intangibles and being able to use different accountancy levers to support companies that are making capital investment decisions, and well, any kind of investment decisions really. Any reflections on conversations in your boards around sort of what tools company needs, what they can do already within the current rules, what rules would really help, and also what that kind of message to governments needs to be in the context of unlocking some of the climate finance pledges that have come forward? I don't know who might want to come in first on that question. Karina.
Yeah, I can. I mean, it obviously depends on which sector you operate on, but we have the EU taxonomy, which has moved us forward a lot. I remember in my oil company, there were some things that the company was very, very upset about because the taxonomy they felt did not give sufficient recognition to biofuel blends. Basically, unless you sold a fuel that was 100% biofuel, you got no credit whatsoever, as opposed to a 15% blend you should get. So they felt that was unrealistic because the taxation is such that 100% biofuel is very expensive. But in this other business, which is transmission, 97% of our capex meets the EU taxonomy. So 97% of what we do qualifies for green bonds or sustainably linked bonds or whatever. So there already are tools that enable us to grow. However, let's also remember that we're still constrained by the normal rules of the market, and in particular, leverage. So if a company has to multiply in size by, sixfold, you can't grow that purely with debt. And so you need to be thinking in terms of, well, because if you did, you would lose your investment grade status and you would become junk and your investors would be furious with you. So there needs to be a conversation about, how in a period of massive disruption and, a need to grow extremely quickly, what are the tools that are at our disposal? And I actually think, unfortunately, that we need help from the government to set some very clear parameters about the pace of that growth and the rate at which it will, and as I said earlier, agree reimbursements, because that's how grids grow, is you invest, the government reimburses you within a short period of time, and also permitting. So there are all kinds of policy tools that need to be brought to bear, but actually I think certainly in respect of the taxonomy, we've got a very, very useful accounting tool. And yes, some companies are annoyed, as happened in my oil company, but it still meant that there was a significant percentage of its activities that were taxonomy aligned. And that's really important for being able to tap the greener parts of the finance market.
I mean, Changhua, maybe be great to hear from your perspective.
Can I just, I definitely echo very strongly what Karina just said. I would like to bring in another dimension, which is a cross-border, because as I said, all the new rules, standards will be set, and we are operating in a global economy in many, many ways. And just look at the green finance, the taxonomy as an example. If we do things on our own, and then that's going to be dramatically slowing down actually the transition we said we want to shift. And just using more like as a positive example, like EU, China have been working together to really work on a more aligned actually taxonomy. That has been a very good example in terms of, yes, there are barriers here and there that blocking or slowing down the financial flow, particularly from cross-border perspective. But if we, each other really willing to work together, there are solutions there. I wouldn't say that's going to totally address the problem overnight, but somehow there are examples like that actually already. Now, the second point, particularly from China perspective, actually, China somehow has been, well, we move things very fast if we want to do it. So really focusing on the greening the financial sector. So if you look at a green bond, China is already the world's largest green bond issuer. So, if you look at it, outstanding sort of asset there, it's the largest. And so in the last decade or so, from the policy perspective, it's very positive signal in terms of really policymakers are taking the steps to greening the financial institutions, the financial sectors, so that will be really aligned with the national agenda to deliver the 1+N. I mentioned actually national strategic system change there. But in reality, there are barriers. This is not a rosy road at all because of those rules, the financial market rules, whatever. Just to give you one example, 2 days ago, I was at a session. I was chairing climate finance, actually, small group session discussion there. The universal voices actually from banks, financial institutions is that, on one side, they cheered for us in a way, say, look at China's renewable energy, really revolutionary, with all the numbers that is there. But these days, actually, banks are not making money anymore, right? So that tells you something. Banks, financial institutions need to make money. If they cannot really get whatever reasonable return, that's a huge risk. They're not going to really invest in that. So today, more than ever, I think we need to get down to that level of details, literally on the ground level, to really understand what are blocking, slowing down the financial flows. Otherwise, we cannot, if we do not address them, we cannot possibly deliver what we said we're going to do.
Thank you, Changhua. I don't know if Pim or Christina, you want to add anything to that kind of conversation around sort of how do we get either more in access to finance? How can companies better account for the way that they're spending money? I mean, any other reflections? Pim, do you want to come in?
No, maybe I can just jive off a bit of what Changhua said. I mean, climate is the ultimate risk management challenge that we all face, right? And I think one of the interesting debates that were ongoing in COP that I hadn't really heard that strongly was, again, the role that insurance markets could play as an enabler. I mean, insurance has been there from the very beginning. They have a very specific expertise that could help risk management, analyze, but also essentially help with creating trust in some of these technologies that are not at scale, right? But I think that the insurance industry hasn't really figured that out yet. There are a couple of players that are moving ahead. But I'd like to see a little bit more focus on that, hopefully at Davos and at next coming COPs. And then on the accounting mechanism, I think, I mean, from what we're picking up from our communities, one of the biggest initiatives from the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders ahead of COP was to launch our Scope 3 action plan. And when it comes to looking at accounting for Scope 3 emissions, understanding that, particularly as we are going to see large-scale disruptions of supply chain with increased risks, we also need to build the capacity of Scope 3 accounting and target setting in developing countries. So other areas such as trade might be another area where we can come in and help build that capacity. And again, I think, companies sit on a wealth of understanding here of the complexities, but it needs to be coupled with the policy side. So yeah, just a few reflections from my end.
Thank you. Thank you. And Christina, anything you wanted to add?
I think something that is very important is the government, they should be prepared to this. As I said, we have been facing now in Brazil a tax reform that it takes into account the climate change and the development, economic development, that takes into account that the companies, they should be sustainable in an environmental way. Also take into account the climate change and all the things and all the threats that they could hit the business. And another thing that I saw in the discussions during the COP is the companies and the institutions, the bank institutions and foundations, they have been thinking about new business model of financing, and this is improving. And there are some new business models that they are testing. They have been using and testing in order to finance this, especially the new technologies and innovation that is so hard for the companies to move toward and to be the first ones to use, and then to increase or to not to receive all the money that they have been expecting as a business model, normal business model, but everybody will receive a little less, but will be shared with investors and the companies that will be invested. It's something that they have been discussing in order to move forward to innovation, technology, to deal with the decarbonization of their process. Is that?
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I'm going to turn to another one of the questions that have come up, maybe a slightly different question. We've obviously been optimistic about what's come out of COP28, partially because of perhaps the low expectations going in. We've also, I think, recognized that the science is telling us that because we're not on track, we're actually facing some quite challenging, challenging data that's telling us that we may not, be able to get to kind of minimize average global warming by 1.5 degrees. Given that, a lot of businesses have set science-based targets, which are aiming to get to these kinds of goals, what conversations do we need on the board to both kind of like continue to accelerate, to really kind of take on board some of the transformations that are happening, but at the same time kind of deal with this slightly challenging reality of the potential overshoot and how companies are also having to respond to that at the same time. I don't know, it'd be really interesting to know what kind of conversations are going on in boardrooms, and what can we do to make sure that going into future COPs and to the sort of big annual meetings that are happening in all sorts of institutions around the world, just maybe some reflections on how companies are dealing with that slightly sort of challenging juxtaposition. I don't know who wants to start with that one. Maybe Changhua. Thank you.
I'll be happy to come in. Interesting enough, out of the 8 board members of the Tianqi Lithium, 3 of us showed up actually to Dubai, including the vice chair of the board, the CEO, and myself as well. Of course, we stayed different times there. That's a sort of interesting indication in a way that companies like Tianqi Lithium and many others, I call like leadership companies there, are really sort of already on this wagon and to accelerate the transition, partly because Tianqi Lithium is in the opportunity sort of on the opportunity side because of the clean energy transition there. I do want to bring a couple of perspectives actually to this conversation, just using Tianqi Lithium as an example. And so the board, probably more than many other boards, is really on it and really dedicated to driving this transformation. It's because the core part is its business. So, it's not a fossil fuel industry there at all. But as a board member, non-executive board member, I realized one thing. even though we've been, even moving into KPIs with the governance mechanism for sustainability, whatever. But then I realized on myself, I cannot just stay, as a member sitting there say, okay, this is a compliance, this is what you do, whatever, stuff like that. Myself need to learn. And so I've taken the opportunity actually to really start reaching out to different departments within the company and, and really understanding the nitty-gritty details, how the system is set up, how they work with each other. I'm getting more clarity on that. That's really fulfilling sort of, achievement on myself, a small thing, but really significant for me. I think that's important. We cannot just talk about and say, oh, let's really become more ambitious, because without the delivery capability, this whole system change part, but, well understood, figured out, whatever we say, mostly remain on the talking side. We won't be able to achieve that. The sense of urgency, I think we're all in this together, but I feel like we don't have any other options there. We committed to this transition. There's only way to do. We might not get there, as we said, in the timeline manner, whatever stuff like that. We have to bear the consequences, but somehow we just need to carry on and figure out how to work with everyone together to shift, to transition away from fossil fuels. This is definitely a collective journey we have to, work together. Thanks.
Christina, I was just wondering, in the context of the boards that you're on and sort of this conversation around the desire and the ambition to get to a sort of 1.5 future, but the sort of challenge around what it's going to take to get there and the latest science coming out. It'd be great just to hear your reflections.
I think board members, they have, first, they have to be more educated about this issue now. It's very important to have some conversations, of course, but what I can see sometimes is that this conversation should be more structured, and should the board members, they should study more about the problems that we will be facing in the near future. And the second thing is that the board members, they should work with directors in order to put this climate change and the risks of climate change in the risk matrix, and then in the strategic plan, and then put money in order to avoid these problems for the business. Because when you invest on this, of course, this is a serious thing. And then you communicate this for the companies, and then, of course, everybody will work and we will focus on the same thing. The third thing is, I think the board members, they can work during the construction of the sustainability report, not just receive it at the end of the year or in March of the year, the next year, in order then, okay, then I approve. No, we have to work together. This way, we will learn, and then we will participate in order to have really good indicators that will measure the impact of the actions that will be planned in the strategic plan. Is that then I think this way, of course, we'll put this in agenda in most of the meetings of the board. Yeah, and this will be a serious thing if we do this for the company. Yes, is that.
Yeah. I'm going to ask one sort of final wrap-up question, and I'm going to come to all of you with a similar question, slightly nuanced for you, Pim. But I guess going into Davos, I guess what will you personally, in your role and everything that you've been hearing from COP, what will you be going into in the context of encouraging the conversations with board directors should be really focused on when they're in their boardroom conversations? And I guess for the rest, it's really kind of what conversations, what questions are you going to take to your boards in the context of everything you've been hearing? So Pim, maybe I'll come to you first.
No, great, thank you. I think what we're going into Davos with from the Alliance of CEO Climate Leaders perspective is focusing on where we can have outsized impact. We released a thought leadership report going into COP, looking at the fact that we need to get to a 7% per annum decrease, and we're currently at a 1.5% increase. So that's the reality. So definitely in this space, we need to focus on areas where we can have outsized impact. For us, that is scope 3. Of course, we work with companies to do the internal business transformation of setting an internal carbon pricing, linking remuneration to climate performance, working with your board. But how companies can be part of that systemic shift that has been mentioned several times, that is, I think, what's going to make or break this transition. So systemic shifts and outsized impact would be the key areas we're going into.
Thank you, Pim. And Karina, maybe to you next. What questions are you bringing to your boards, or what will you be hoping that they'll focus on in the coming years?
So it's a question I've brought to my board several times. It's a question I bring to you, Pim, if I may. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's regarding so-called Scope 4, which has been kicked around for about 10 years, but we still haven't made a great deal of progress on developing a widely recognized and accepted methodology. But just to explain to everybody, this kind of shorthand label is this idea of measuring the emissions that a company's activities help to withdraw from the system. So if you think of, I'm now, obviously biased because I have a company that's, a major, contributor to electrifying the power generation system. And so right now, everybody is just obsessed with, the more we grow, the more our scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions grow through our supply chains. And I keep saying, but guys, forest, trees, every time we build a new connection, we're taking a multiple of what we emit out of the system. So let's participate in the discussions around developing this methodology, because we will be a direct beneficiary and it needs to be done. So GFANS has been looking at it. It's actually quite a heavily debated thing, because I know one oil company in particular, not my former one, thank God, that has been arguing that it should be credited Scope 4 emissions for every time it produces more gas that will theoretically displace coal. So the emissions that are saved, they should get credit for and apply against all of their emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3 as an oil company. Yet we can't do that. So, I would be great. And I'd love to know, Pim, whether the forum is looking at this issue, because I know WBCSD is.
I think it's one of those things. There's a kind of avoided emissions piece, and I guess also a kind of contribution piece. And I guess it's also a question around that opportunity side is really important. In the interest of time, Karina, it might be one to take offline with Pim.
Okay.
Christina, I'll come to you next. What kind of question is top of mind for your boards going into this next cycle?
All my boards, as I said, they are part of the segment of the oil and gas and fossil fuels, no? All of them. And then the question is, what will do next? This is the question, because I know that this is the business that should move toward other things. And then how can we move and then to perpetuate this company by doing other things? This is my question now for the board.
That's just incredible. It's such an important conversation and we don't think about it enough. It's one thing to talk about transitioning away from fossil fuels, but to be thinking about, the new business models, the new, what are these businesses going to look like in the future? I love that question. I think we should be encouraging all of your colleagues sitting on those boards to be asking that. Changhua, what would your question be?
Sure. I think for me, relatively easy, simple and easy, just stay on it and deliver. And so we need to build up capability, capacity, really driving through all the target. We set a science-based target already. We set 2015 net zero. We said we are going to work with all the supply partners, supply value chain partners to deliver. I don't need to educate the other board members. It's more like a really build up the capability and deliver. Now, this is the internally. Externally, linked with internally, I'm taking on part of the leadership actually to work with the PIM and the World Economic Forum to really drive this Scope 3 supply chain transformation. China focused because China occupying a big part of the value chain, particularly for clean energy transformation or transition away from fossil fuels there. So China is uniquely positioned actually to take the leadership. And that part of the work is already sort of taking off. And hopefully somehow we'll be able to expand our network, getting more resources supported from you guys, and so we can work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Changhua. Well, that just leaves me to thank all of you for joining this fascinating discussion. It's really interesting to hear these different perspectives from around the world and from different sectors. So really, really appreciate all of your insights. Also want to just thank everybody that joined us today, and obviously we'll be sending the recording to many people who weren't able to join us live. We will have a wrap-up briefing note that we'll be sending round to our network, taking insights from this conversation and obviously all the scanning of information coming out of COP28 over the last couple of weeks. So we really appreciate all of the input for that. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. It's been a wonderful conversation. And if you're not already a member of one of our chapters around the world, then please do find out who's your local chapter and sign up and join. Thank you all so much, and looking forward to the next outcomes from Davos next, I think, Pim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.